Your watch ticks in 60-minute hours. Your compass turns in 360-degree circles. And the beer in your hand was brewed using a recipe older than the pyramids. None of these were accidents. A forgotten people who built their world from river mud and reeds decided how you would measure time, space, and taste, and then vanished so completely that for 4,000 years, no one even knew they'd existed. They occupied a land that seemed designed to destroy them, a blistering floodplain between two volatile rivers with no stone, no timber, and soil that cracked under a merciless sun. By every geological calculation, their story should have been one of survival, a brief struggle before extinction. Instead, they built the first cities, authored the first laws, and wrote the first epic poem. They didn't just survive. They invented the operating system for civilization itself, themselves the black-headed people, and from the swampy marshes of southern Mesopotamia, they launched a cultural revolution so profound that it's still running in the background of your life. How did a culture with no natural resources become the blueprint for everything from bureaucracy to beer? And what drove a queen's entire court to willingly walk into their own graves? This is the story of the Sumerians, the architects of reality who built so well that history itself forgot they existed. To grasp their genius, you first have to understand the brutal landscape that forged them. Southern Mesopotamia wasn't a garden. It was a paradox. Rain was a myth. When storms did come, they arrived as violent walls of water that would drown the plain and then retreat, leaving behind a landscape of cracked, sun-baked earth. The Tigris and Euphrates were lifelines, but they were erratic, cruel ones. Unlike the predictable Nile, these rivers could surge without warning, swallow villages, and change their courses overnight. The land oscillated between drowning and drought, a chaos so ingrained that it seeped into their mythology, birthing the story of a great flood meant to wipe out humanity, a tale that would echo millennia later in the book of Genesis. But beneath that hostility lay a hidden wealth. For eons, the rivers had deposited layers of the richest silt on earth. The soil was a sleeping giant, but it demanded a price. To unlock its potential, they had to master water itself. And this single, desperate condition, the need to tame the twin rivers, became the engine that would drive humanity from scattered villages into the age of cities. Before the Sumerians rose to prominence, a precursor culture, known to archaeologists as the Ubaid, had already laid the groundwork. They dug the first simple irrigation ditches and built mud brick temples, living in small farming settlements. But they didn't build cities or invent writing. Then, around the end of the 4th millennium BC, a new people appeared. Their origin is a linguistic mystery. The Sumerian language is an isolate, with no known relatives. It stands alone in the history of human speech. Even their names for the rivers, Tigris and Euphrates, and their greatest cities weren't Sumerian words. Someone was here before them, teaching them the names of the land. According to their own myths, they sailed from a paradise island called Dilmun, possibly modern-day Bahrain. Whether fact or legend, one thing is certain. Once they settled, the landscape of human existence would never be the same. Their first and most monumental innovation wasn't a tool, but a decision. To reorganize the world on a scale never before attempted. You couldn't just plant seeds here and pray for rain. To survive, you had to slice canals across the land for miles, build levees to corral the spring floods, and dredge the silt from the waterways year after year. This wasn't a family chore. It was a coordinated effort involving thousands. The irrigation networks they built were colossal. A single city-state managed an agricultural zone of nearly 300 square kilometers, a web of canals, reservoirs, and meticulously watered fields. Miss a single season of dredging, and the canals would choke with silt. Miss a season of repairs, and the levees would collapse, unleashing destruction. The rivers demanded relentless labor. This relentless necessity was the true birth of the city. It wasn't ambition that drew people together. It was the math of survival. When your existence depends on a system so vast and fragile, you need an organizer. Someone to assign labor, measure water, settle disputes between upstream and downstream villages. From this need, a new class of authority emerged. At the heart of every Sumerian city rose a ziggurat, a stepped temple tower that pierced the flat horizon like a man-made mountain. But it wasn't just a temple. It was the city's beating heart, a granary, a tax office, a courthouse, and a textile factory all in one. The priests who managed it controlled the land, the water, and the labor. They claimed all land belonged to the gods, and they were simply the divine administrators. By 3800 BC, the village was obsolete. The city had arrived. The greatest of these was Uruk. At its peak, between 40,000 and 80,000 people lived within its walls. For a species that had lived in tribes of 20 or 30 for millennia, this density was a radical experiment. In a village, life was governed by familiarity. You knew everyone. In Uruk, you moved among thousands of strangers. Social order could no longer rely on personal relationships. It required institutions. And institutions required records. In a village of 30, you can remember who owes what. In a city of 50,000, you cannot. So, writing was born not from a poet's inspiration, but from an accountant's desperation. The oldest known written tablets, found in Uruk and dating to around 3300 BC, contain no myths, no songs. They are inventories, lists of sheep, barley, and labor hours. Writing began as bureaucracy. Before these tablets, they used a system of clay tokens cones for grain, spheres for larger amounts. But as the economy grew, storing thousands of tokens became a logistical nightmare. So, temple officials made a leap. They started pressing the tokens into soft clay, replacing the physical object with its image. Representation had begun. From there, evolution accelerated. The token impressions became simplified drawings, pictograms. A picture of a head meant head, a bowl meant food. At first, there were over 2,000 signs, a clumsy system. But then, the Sumerians discovered the key that would unlock the future. Symbols could represent sounds. The Sumerian word for arrow had a specific sign, but once they grasped phonetics, that same sign could be used wherever that sound appeared, regardless of meaning. Suddenly, they could write full sentences, grammar, and nuance. The complexity of spoken language could be captured in clay. Sumerian scribes used a reed stylus to press wedge-shaped marks into wet clay. We call it cuneiform. From the Latin for wedge, it became the dominant writing system of the ancient Near East for over 3,000 years. Adopted by the Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians, clay proved to be the perfect medium. Unlike papyrus or parchment, when clay is fired, even accidentally in a city's destruction, it becomes virtually indestructible. Over 1 million cuneiform tablets have been recovered. They tell us more about daily life in the 3rd millennium BC than we know about most of medieval Europe. With writing, debts, taxes, and laws became fixed. They could no longer be forgotten or retold differently. For the first time, a system could remember more than any person and hold everyone accountable. The Sumerian gift to humanity didn't stop with writing. Their numbering system was based on 60. Why? They counted the 12 knuckles on one hand with their thumb, using the 5 fingers of the other hand to track groups of 12. 5 times 12 equals 60. This simple gesture gave us 24 hours, 60 minutes, 60 seconds, and 360 degrees in a circle. Every glance at a clock or compass is a tribute to a Sumerian scribe. Their mathematics were advanced. They solved quadratic equations, understood the Pythagorean theorem 1,000 years before Pythagoras, and calculated the area of triangles. They invented the plow, freeing labor for specialized trades. They gave us the wheel first, as rollers, then as axles, then as chariots. They built the first arches and columns, invented the sailboat, and created the first known legal codes, covering property, marriage, and crime centuries before Hammurabi. And then there was beer. They developed the first known brewing process, fermenting barley into a thick drink consumed through long reed straws from communal jars. It was a dietary staple, likely safer than city water, and so revered they had a goddess for it, Ninkasi, the lady who fills the mouth. The hymn to Ninkasi is essentially the oldest known beer recipe, praising malting and fermentation in verse. They also invented soap, mixing animal fat with lye, and created the first schools, where elite boys studied reading, writing, and law. Education isn't a modern invention. It's a Sumerian one. When a Sumerian fell ill, 2 experts would arrive. The first was the Asu*, a physician. He would check the pulse, study the urine, and prescribe herbal salves, compresses of oil and thyme, tinctures dissolved in beer. The oldest known medical tablet, for Nippur, contains 15 specific prescriptions. Pulverize branches of the thorn plant, pour diluted beer over it, rub with vegetable oil, and fasten the paste over the sick spot. No magic, just pure pharmaceutics, 2,000 years before Hippocrates. The second expert was the Ashipu*, an exorcist. For the Sumerians, illness had a dual nature, a physical symptom and a spiritual cause, a demon or an angry god. The Ashipu* determined which spirit was responsible and banished it through incantations. Both systems operated in parallel, and neither was seen as inferior. A patient received both an herbal salve and a prayer. To treat the body without addressing the spirit would have been as strange as treating a fever while ignoring the wound. Their medical records were so detailed that scholars can identify descriptions of nearly every major disease. Their herbal catalog listed roughly 340 medicinal plants, organized from head to toe, just like a modern anatomy textbook. This meticulous attention to keeping people in the world of the living made their burial rituals all the more shocking. The boundary between life and death was, for them, permeable. A king didn't die. He simply crossed over, and his court crossed with him. In the 1920s, British archaeologist Leonard Woolley excavated the ancient city of Ur and found the physical proof. Beneath the surface lay a royal cemetery with 1,800 graves. Most were simple, but 16 were different. Enormous underground chambers, approached by ramps filled with breathtaking treasures. Golden helmets, lapis lazuli necklaces, silver lyres, and the famous standard of Ur. But the treasures weren't the most disturbing find. It was the bodies surrounding the royal chambers. Woolley found rows of soldiers in copper helmets, women in golden headdresses arranged in neat lines, and musicians still lying beside their instruments. In the largest, which he called the Great Death Pit, 74 bodies were found, 6 men and 68 women, all dressed in finery, all arranged in careful order. The headdresses were undisturbed. They had walked into the pit, sat down, and died. Woolley believed they took poison willingly. But recent CT scans of skulls revealed something darker, premortem fractures from a blunt instrument. For some, the poison wasn't enough. They were struck on the head to ensure no one was buried alive. Among the dead was a queen named Pwabi, her crown of golden flowers still resting on her skull, her entire court lying silent around her for eternity. We've traced how they invented schools, medicine, and law. It all sounds familiar, like the prehistory of our own world. The death pits of Ur are a reminder that the civilization we inherit was effective, not necessarily just. The very institutions that fed the people could demand they walk into a pit and lie down beside their queen. For centuries, the Sumerian city-states existed in a state of constant rivalry. Each had its own walls, god, and army. No single ruler unified the region. Then came Sargon. His origin story is legendary. Born to a priestess who set him adrift in a reed basket on the Euphrates, he was found and raised by a gardener. He became a cupbearer to the king of Kish. What happened next is lost to a broken clay tablet. But when the record resumes, Sargon is king. He didn't just conquer. He transformed the nature of power. He replaced the heavy Sumerian phalanx with a faster, more flexible army of archers. He marched south, defeated the reigning king, and in a calculated humiliation, paraded him in chains through the temple gates. Then he pushed north to Syria, east to Elam, creating the first multi-ethnic empire in history, stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. To administer it, he appointed governors across provinces and built a new capital, Akkad, a city so completely lost that it has never been found. But to conquer is not to unite. His empire spoke two languages, Sumerian in the south and Akkadian in the north. The sword could force submission, but it couldn't forge a common identity. For that, Sargon used not his army, but his own daughter. In all of human literature, there is a first. The first person to put their own thoughts into writing and sign them with their name. Her name was Enheduanna, Sargon's daughter. He appointed her as the high priestess of the great temple of Yor, the most powerful religious position in Mesopotamia. But she was far more than a political pawn. She was a poet. She composed hymns in both Sumerian and Akkadian, helping to weave a common cultural identity between conqueror and conquered. But her most remarkable works were personal. She wrote in the first person, describing her own emotions, her fear, her suffering, her devotion. As far as we know, no one had ever done this before. When a political rebellion forced her from her temple, she wrote directly to the goddess Inanna. I, who once sat triumphant, was driven from my sanctuary. I was forced to flee among the swallows. My life is consumed. I approached the light, but the light scorched me. This isn't a government record. It's an individual consciousness pouring itself onto clay. The birth of the lyric voice. The beginning of literature as self-expression. The rebellion was eventually crushed, and she returned to her temple. But her legacy was this. Before the pyramids were even built, a woman invented the idea that personal experience was worth recording, that an individual's inner life mattered enough to be preserved. Every memoir, every poem that begins with I, traces its lineage back to her. But her father's empire lived by the sword. Sargon's grandson, Naram-Sin, took it further, declaring himself a living god, the first ruler in history to claim divinity, and adopting the title King of the Four Corners of the World. Under him, the Akkadian Empire reached its zenith. But empires carry the seeds of their own collapse. A severe drought destabilized agriculture. From the mountains, a people called the Gushans began raiding. Within a generation of Naram-Sin's death, the empire that had conquered the known world ceased to exist. The Gushans were a mountain people who didn't understand the complex irrigation systems. The canals deteriorated, agriculture collapsed, and cities were abandoned. Around 2120 BC, a Sumerian king drove the Gushans out, and power passed to the city of Yor under a ruler named Ur-Nammu, founding what we call the third dynasty of Ur, the last great Sumerian kingdom. Ur-Nammu rebuilt the canals, constructed the great ziggurat of Ur, whose ruins still rise from the Iraqi plains today, and compiled one of the earliest known law codes. But the revival was fragile. Over-irrigation had poisoned the soil with salt, causing crop yields to fall. From the west, nomadic tribes pushed in. From the east, the old enemy Elam grew bolder. In 2004 BC, the Elamites sacked Ur. The fall was so traumatic, the Sumerians wrote a lament for it, describing the gods abandoning the city, mothers fleeing with children, the dead lying in the streets. With the fall of Ur, the Sumerian people ceased to exist as a political entity. The dynasties that followed, including Babylon under Hammurabi, inherited their cities, their gods, their writing, and their literature. The Sumerian language survived for centuries as a scholarly tongue, much like Latin in medieval Europe, before it too fell silent. And then something extraordinary happened. The world forgot them entirely. The Egyptians left pyramids. The Greeks left marble temples, but the Sumerians built with mud brick. Over centuries, their great cities crumbled into mounds indistinguishable from the desert. Their civilization literally dissolved back into the landscape. For nearly 4,000 years, no one knew they had ever existed. It wasn't until the 1800s that European archaeologists, digging in the deserts of Iraq, began pulling clay tablets from the earth. They realized they were reading a language older than Greek, older than Hebrew, older than Sanskrit. A people erased from human memory was slowly reassembled from the fragments of their own records. Today, every time you check the clock, divide a circle, pour a beer, or write your name, you are using a Sumerian inheritance. They built the architecture of daily life, and then disappeared so completely that we lived inside their inventions for millennia without knowing whose hands had made them. The Sumerians didn't conquer the future with armies. They conquered it with ideas. And ideas, unlike empires, do not fall. If you enjoyed this journey into the forgotten architects of our world, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Winds of Thought for more explorations of the hidden currents that shape history. What piece of ancient knowledge do you think we take for granted most? Let me know in the comments below.